Welcome to Logger Lectures Online, part of our series of digital lectures presented by the McMaster Alumni Association. These in-person and online lectures are named after McMaster graduate Albert Abram Logger, a great believer in the value of lifelong education. He created the Albert Abram Logger Foundation, which supports several organizations in their efforts, including the McMaster Alumni Association.
Unstructured search, and these algorithms were designed to
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the online Logger Lecture, Canada and Slavery. We'll be hearing from Professor Maxime Dagenais. Max is the research coordinator at McMaster University's Wilson Institute for Canadian History. He's also an Adjunct Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Humanities Department of History. Here's a little bit about Max. He grew up in Montreal, so of course he's a Habs fan, and he developed his love of history by reading Asterix books. As the child of a separatist father and a federalist mother, Canadian and Quebecois history was part of dinner-time conversation. He took that love and earned a BA in history from Concordia University, and then completed his master's and PhD at the University of Ottawa. He followed up his studies with 2 postdoctoral fellowships. First at the McNeill Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and then he made his way to us, to the Wilson Institute for Canadian History. He's been at Max since 2016. Max co-edited a book titled Revolutions Across Borders, The Canadian Rebellion and Jacksonian America. And he just recently wrote a chapter called The Canadian Rebellion, the American South, and Slavery. This brings us to today's talk. Please welcome Max Dagenais.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for this generous introduction, and welcome to my home. I hope everyone is safe and everyone is comfortable at home. Before we start, I'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge that the territory I'm currently on is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And though we are meeting here today in a virtual setting, I'd like to invite you all to reflect on the territories you reside on the history of settler colonialism of our nation, and how you can help fight injustice, racism, and inequality in your everyday lives. So once again, I am in my house, so if my kids come barging in, my apologies. But I locked the door and everything, and I tried my best to make sure that they're going to stay out there. So let's get started. So who here remembers the Heritage Minute on the Underground Railroad from the 1990s? For those of you that do, can you raise your hands, please? Actually, I'm kidding. I can't actually see you right now. But I'm assuming that most of you somewhat remember the Heritage Minute. And for those of you who don't, I have a slide over here. Just keep it going. There you go. And in it, in this Heritage Minute, we're introduced to 2 enslaved African Americans, a mother and her son, who escaped to Canada using the famed Underground Railroad. Both are waiting for the husband/father to arrive, fearing the worst and that he was captured before crossing the border. The mother runs out crying, only to finally see him arrive. The Heritage Minute ends with a narrator telling us, and I quote, between 1840 and 1860, more than 30,000 American slaves came secretly to Canada and freed them. They called it the Underground Railroad. Another favorite is the Jackie Robinson Heritage Minute, which I have over here. There you go. And in this one, we're introduced to the famous African-American baseball player that put an end to Major League Baseball's color barrier. The Heritage Minute covers Jackie Robinson's time in Canada as a member of the Montreal Royals Baseball Club, the AAA affiliate of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the hat I am currently wearing. And in it, Jackie Robinson takes the plate and is hit by a pitch by the opposing pitcher playing for the Newark, New Jersey Baseball Club. The pitcher was sending a clear message to Jackie Robinson that he did not belong here. The crowd in Montreal started booing the pitcher in support of Robinson. In the next scene, Jackie Robinson hits one of his many home runs. The adoring fans start screaming, "Bravo, Jackie," as the crowd starts chanting, "Jackie, Jackie, Jackie." The narrator concludes that, and I quote, record numbers of cheering Montrealers helped Jackie Robinson break baseball's color barrier that year. He never forgot the city that launched his journey to baseball's Hall of Fame. Now, though these heritage minutes provide feel-good moments of our history, they exaggerate the perception that Canada was without fault with regards to slavery and the treatment of racialized populations, especially when we compare ourselves to our neighbors to the south. Particularly, these feel-good stories conceal a dark part of our history that many in Canada are just now discovering. And that is that just like the United States, there was violent and state-supported slavery in Canada. More importantly, slavery left a lasting legacy on Canada. In Policing Black Lives, Robin Maynard argued that slavery affected, and I quote, the treatment of Black persons living in Canada for centuries to come. It created, amongst other things, a system of segregation and of intense surveillance and policing that we still have today. Thus, saying that we're not as bad as the United States, as many of us like to say, isn't good anymore. We need to recognize that slavery is part of our history, the legacy of systemic racism it created, and work together to end it. Now, slavery in Canada is not a recent discovery made by historians. Since the 1960s, historians have often pointed out that slavery has been a part of our history as soon as European settlers arrived. However, many of these early studies reduced the impact of slavery in Canada, arguing that it wasn't as widespread and that it was much milder than what we see in the United States. Although it is true that slavery in Canada never reached the size and importance that we witness in the southern states or the Caribbean, where massive plantations dominated and were the cornerstone of the local economy, this should not take away from the fact that slavery in Canada was as oppressive, as degrading, and as violent. It was not milder. And as scholars like Frank McKee and Robin Maynard have shown, white settlers in Canada also sought large-scale plantations. The climate quite simply did not allow for it. And as historian Afua Cooper stated, Canada may not have been a slave society, that is a society whose economy was based on slavery, but it was a society with slaves. Now, for the next 30-ish minutes, I'm going to provide a very general overview of the history of slavery in Canada. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the enslavement of Indigenous and African peoples in the era of New France and British North America. Though I'm not going to discuss the details, I hope that this talk will provide you all with a starting point to further educate yourselves on this very important topic. Now, as a historian of the period between 1760 and 1850, slavery features prominently in my own work. My work, for instance, looks at the correlation between the Canadian Rebellion of 1837-38, the American South, and slavery. However, I am not the expert on the actual practice of slavery in Canada. There's been some amazing studies on the topic of slavery in Canada, and throughout this text, I'll point out key ones that you should all consider to further educate yourselves on this important topic. Now, during the era of New France, French settlers had enslaved people, and we have evidence that slavery is almost as old as the colony itself. There's evidence that by 1628, at the very least, there were enslaved people in the colony. In 1689, the French king, Louis XIV, granted settlers permission to bring enslaved Africans to the colony. In 1709, with the Radeau Ordinance, the ordinance further confirmed the legality of Indigenous and African enslaved people in the colony. French settlers responded enthusiastically to slavery, so enthusiastically, in fact, that it became a key point in the Articles of Capitulation of New France in 1760, which of course took place after a year after the famous Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Now, according to one of the Articles of Capitulation, and let me just get my slide over here, enslaved people of both sexes shall remain in their quality of slaves in the possession of the French and Canadians to whom they belong. They shall be at liberty to keep them in their service in the colony or to sell them, and may continue to bring them up in the Roman religion. What is clear here is that French settlers were not only allowed to keep their enslaved African and indigenous peoples, but as historian Natasha Henry noted, this article more importantly illustrated that slavery was important enough in New France that it warranted a separate clause. This is very revealing of the place that slavery had in New France. As stated, settlers in New France were not opposed to turning their colony into Caribbean-style colony with plantations and everything. The only thing stopping them was the weather. Now, during the era of New France, enslaved indigenous men, women, and children accounted for the majority of enslaved peoples. And this is the topic of a very important 2014 study by a historian known as Brett Rushford. In Bonds of Alliance, Indigenous and Atlantic Slaveries in New France, Rushford presents a darker side to the traditional rosy view of French settler colonialism along the St. Lawrence River, a view that suggests that French settlers were, compared to their British counterparts, more accepting of Indigenous cultures and more willing to live on equal terms with Indigenous people. Accordingly, and I quote, and I have a here you go, and this is also the cover of Brett's book, the bonds of alliance that brought French and indigenous societies together in the 17th and 18th centuries were inseparable from the bonds of slavery. Now, when the French arrived in North America and allied themselves with indigenous groups such as the Ottawas, the Ojibways, the Hurons, and the Illinois, they became active participants in a complex pre-existing indigenous system of captivity in the region. This system of captivity was very different from the European system of slavery that we're all familiar with. There was no structure of enslavement in this system. Captives were not always enslaved for life, and their children were not born into slavery like we see in European enslavement systems. Through a concept known as kinship, there were many ways in which captives could be brought back into these indigenous societies. There was no system of structural exclusion or the enslavement of a whole group or people, nor was there the practice of enslaving those that were considered, and I quote, inferior, like we see in European enslavement systems. Now, the French benefited from this system as they and their allies enslaved indigenous people in the 1700s. Many of which found their way to the French colony along the St. Lawrence River, where they were enslaved on farms as domestic servants and on the fur trade. The French did more than participate in this system. They expanded it. They encouraged its growth as French settler colonialism, French territorial expansion, the fur trade, and fur wars intensified the violence, intensified the need for slave labor, and expanded the trafficking of indigenous men, women, and children. Now, thousands of enslaved indigenous peoples were sent to New France in the years between 1660 and 1760. Unfortunately, we don't have a precise number for the amount of indigenous men, women, and children that were enslaved in New France. It's quite simply impossible to know how many enslaved people were transported to and sold all over the colony. Our historical records are unfortunately just incomplete. Although some church records did keep statistics and do mention when an enslaved person arrived in a parish, we do know that these statistics only represent a small fraction. Many of the enslaved individuals that were sold and traded by French traders were traded by individuals that, first of all, had no legal right to participate in the trade, and as a result, they kept their transactions secret. Now, according to Brett Rushford, the vast majority of enslaved people in New France were sold off the books and were thus, as a result, undetected. And this skews our numbers. We do know, however, that there were thousands and that they represented a significant part of New France's population. Now, Brett Rushford created this amazing interactive database that you can find on slate.com, and I have the slide over here. It's an animation that displays the names of 1,200 enslaved indigenous people that we know were in New France during this period. And as the names pop up, you can click on the ones in red to get more biographical information. It's a great visual representation of the scope of slavery in this period. So on my slide, you see 1687, and then the names kind of like come in and out of focus as they, as they appear in the record, and then they disappear when they basically, when they die. And then if you click on the individual here that his name is Pierre, you get biographical information, where he was from, where he lived, and where he died. So really do check it out. It's a great database. Now, though we still don't have a clear number or a clear sense of the numbers, we do know, however, that enslaved Indigenous peoples played an important role in expanding and developing the colony. For example, let us consider French westward expansion around modern-day Detroit or Detroit. In order to expand and produce enough resources to feed New France's western garrisons, the colony, the French, they needed a large labor force. And this was a constant problem for New France, who had a small settler population compared to the British colonies to the south. French settlers were thus more than happy to use enslaved labor to make up for the small settler labor force. At Detroit, enslaved Indigenous men, women, and children worked on farms, they tended livestock. It's estimated that 1 out of 4 families in the area had enslaved individuals, and enslaved individuals produced more than 50% of the town's wheat, oats, and beef. Thus, as New France expanded, so did the need for more laborers and settler reliance on enslaved individuals. And as French demands for enslaved individuals increased, so did slave raids on the part of their Indigenous allies. As I stated earlier, French settlers and French actions amplified the practice. Now, life as an enslaved person was, as you can imagine, terrible. And though many like to claim that slavery in Canada was milder than what we see in the United States, its impact on the enslaved populations was equally violent, degrading, and oppressive. Slide, here we go. Most enslaved Indigenous people worked as domestic laborers. According to Brett Rushford, they supplemented rather than structured the labor regime of the areas they lived in. Working as domestic laborers in cities like Montreal, Quebec, and Trois-Rivières came with its own unique struggles compared to working on plantations. For instance, the pressures to assimilate were extremely high. Since these enslaved individuals worked closely and lived in the same household as their captors and were constantly under their supervision, the pressures to adopt French and Roman Catholicism were constant. According to Rushford, enslaved Indigenous peoples in New France were thus, and I quote, far less likely to enjoy religious and cultural independence than their peers in planter colonies. Being forced into Catholicism was a common experience for the vast majority of enslaved Indigenous people. Abuse, sickness, and an early death was also very common. Enslaved Indigenous men, children, and women were the targets of taunts and derisions. They were beaten by soldiers who treated them like enemies, were severely punished, and not provided with substantial food and clothing. They were provided with insufficient clothing to survive the winter months, and they generally slept on kitchen floors or outside, even in the winter, which of course provided them with no shelter from the elements. Enslaved Indigenous peoples were especially vulnerable to disease. Life expectancy was therefore very low, with 50% dying before the age of 14 and 75% dying before their 20th birthday. And this should come as no surprise. When you consider the trauma of capture, the long transportation to Montreal, Quebec City, or Trois-Rivières, corporal punishment, terrible food, terrible clothing, and terrible shelter, and the exhaustion that resulted from extreme labor, it's no surprise that their bodies could not recover from sickness or injury. Now, women were especially vulnerable. And here I'm going to talk about a very sensitive subject, sexual violence. Now, along with all of the above, Indigenous enslaved women were often the victims of sexual violence. As women were forced to work in white settler households, the threat of sexual violence from their captors was constant. Enslaved Indigenous women's bodies became the property of white settler men, and these men took advantage of their, and I quote, sexual accessibility. Enslaved women were also made available to French traders that stopped by, something that Brett Rushford called sexual hospitality. The intermarriage of men, of settler men and Indigenous women was also based on coercion, not cooperation. These marriages were so common in the Western frontier near Detroit and Fort Michilimackinac that it became known as à la façon du pays, or the way of the country. And Rushford mentions, and I quote, any sex that occurred in the context of such unequal power, when the woman was never free to refuse, should be considered a form of sexual extortion akin to, if not equal to, rape. And though some women did eventually carve out a space for themselves in French settler society as a result of these marriages, this often came after, and I quote, a prolonged submission to what could be defined as serial rape. Now, several scholars and reports, such as the TRC and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls' report, have made direct links between this sexual violence and the ongoing violence of colonialism and colonial ideologies that we see today against Indigenous women. Our treatment of Indigenous peoples continues to have devastating consequences. Let's turn our attention to the enslavement of African people in New France. Though Indigenous enslaved women, children, and men were more numerous, historian Afua Cooper reminds us that there were enslaved Africans in New France. In a book titled The Hanging of Angélique, which is here, Cooper tells us the very little known story of Marie-Joseph Angélique, an enslaved African woman that was tortured and hung in Montreal in 1734. A woman that has become the symbol of African-Canadian resistance in Canada. Now, Angélique was born in Portugal as an enslaved woman. She arrived in New France in 1725 and was enslaved until her death in 1734. Angélique was very vocal about her opposition to slavery, her opposition to her poor treatment, and her hatred of her white captors and white settlers in general. She even tried to run away. Angélique was enslaved by the de Francheville family, and on April 10th, 1734, fire was seen coming from the family's attic, which eventually spread around Old Montreal. Angélique was arrested on suspicions of arson, and after a 2-month trial, she was declared guilty and hung on June 21st, 1734. The hangman that executed her was also an enslaved African. Now, to historian Afua Cooper, the story of Angélique perfectly encapsulates the treatment of the history of slavery in Canada. How slavery, a practice that was institutionalized and very common in New France and in Canada, was forgotten and deleted from our history. The story of Angélique is a major historical event, an event in which an enslaved African woman burnt down a major part of Montreal's central core, including the Hôtel Dieu de Montréal, a symbol of African-Canadian resistance against an oppressor. And yet, it's almost nowhere to be found in our textbooks or discussions of general Canadian history. The story of Angélique is an important one that reveals that enslaved people resisted and fought back, and one that reveals that the enslavement of Africans was an important part of French settler colonial society. In fact, close to 1,500 Africans were enslaved by French settlers during the era of New France. The first historically recorded instance of an enslaved African in New France was in 1628, after a young boy from Madagascar was sold to a clerk at Quebec by the Kirk brothers, who at the time had seized the very small colony. The young boy was sold a second time, this time to a French settler called Guillaume Couillard, whose name probably doesn't mean anything to you, but you probably recognize the name of his very good friend, Samuel de Champlain, the famous Samuel de Champlain. So just like enslaved Indigenous people, enslaved Africans answered a specific need in New France, and that was a lack of a labor force. As I mentioned previously, it was pretty clear that as New France expanded, it did not have the labor force to meet the needs of a growing economy and territory. As a result, French settlers looked to slavery. And although French settlers had an ample supply of Indigenous enslaved people, they wanted enslaved Africans. According to Afua Cooper, this was due to the belief that Africans were, and I quote, better able to withstand the physical demands of slavery. And over the next century, enslaved Africans began arriving in New France. Now, enslaved Africans were found all over the colony, from Montreal to Quebec to Detroit. However, the majority were found in urban centers, 75% were in urban centers, and 52% of them were in Montreal alone. And like their Indigenous counterparts, They worked as domestic laborers on farms, in the fur trade. Some were even, as I mentioned earlier, executioners. And like their Indigenous counterparts, they lived hard lives, dying at a very young age, usually at 25. But like their Indigenous counterparts, they also fought back. They ran away, they talked back, they broke tools, they organized uprisings, they burned down towns. Now, during the era of New France, enslaved Indigenous women, children, and men outnumbered enslaved Africans. However, with the fall of New France and the expansion of Great Britain into what is now Canada, this all changes. Britain not only had the resources to bring in more enslaved Africans into the colony, but colonial officials also encouraged the immigration of British American settlers, many of whom had enslaved enslaved Africans to Canada. These measures increased the enslaved African population in Canada, and this is when enslaved Africans began to outnumber enslaved Indigenous peoples. According to Afua Cooper, this was the moment when, and I quote, enslavement gradually became identified with Africans in Canada. Now, slavery in Canada under British rule, especially expanded following the American Revolution, and this was due to the arrival of the loyalists. In fact, in order to encourage and attract the immigration of white settler loyalist families to British North America after the War of US Independence, the British government passed a law that allowed loyalists to bring their enslaved Africans with them, and I quote, duty-free. It's estimated that more than 3,000 enslaved Africans arrived in British North America between the start of the American Revolution and 1790. And while the majority were in the maritime provinces, between 500 and 700 arrived in Upper Canada, which of course is Ontario. And enslaved populations played a massive role in the development of Canada. As Robin Maynard perfectly stated, here I quote, "Unpaid and non-consensual Black labor was critical for the economic growth of Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces. Enslaved Africans worked in mills as blacksmiths, they cleared land, they built roads, they worked on farms and as domestic laborers. They were an important part of Canadian history. In fact, many important settlers had enslaved individuals. Natasha Henry and Afua Cooper provide an intensive list of who had enslaved Africans in Canada. And some of the names that they mention is a who's who of Canadian settler society. For example, James McGill, the founder of the famous McGill University, had enslaved Africans. Walter Patterson, the governor of St. John's Island, which becomes Prince Edward Island, also had some. Closer to home in Ontario or Upper Canada, several members of the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada had enslaved people. And this includes Richard Beasley, who had enslaved people here in Hamilton, and Robert Hamilton, whose son George became the namesake of the city of Hamilton. However, this was not limited to the social and political elite. Several commoners also had enslaved Africans. According to historian Amani Whitfield, here we go, who wrote an important book on slavery in the maritime provinces in the decade following the American Revolution and the arrival of the Loyalists, titled North to Bondage, Loyalist Slavery in the Maritimes. It's a brilliant book. He demonstrates that the use of enslaved labor was not limited to the elite, but even commoners had enslaved Africans, who most often worked as domestic laborers. And to Amani Whitfield, working as domestic laborers was especially difficult. Enslaved Africans were expected to be on call for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And since many lived in the same household as their captors, they never had any respite from their violence, physical and sexual abuse. Torture and sexual violence and exploitation were extremely common. Enslaved African women living with white men often bore children. This also meant that these enslaved people were under more surveillance, 24-hour surveillance, than their counterparts living in plantations and never had any separation. Slavery in Canada was therefore absolutely not a milder form to what we witness in southern United States. It was just different, but equally violent, equally oppressive, and equally degrading. Enslaved people fought back. As I stated earlier, many were openly disobedient, others committed acts of violence and arson against their captors, and many others escaped and ran away. In the period that followed the American Revolution, many escaped to sympathetic Indigenous communities and often escaped to the frontier where they gathered in communities. And perhaps ironically, several others escaped to the United States, specifically to states like Vermont and New Hampshire that had banned slavery, or at the time were in the process of banning slavery in the 1770s, 1780s. Now, I'd like to conclude with a few remarks on the period that followed the abolition of slavery in Canada on the 1st of August, 1834, with the British Parliament's Slavery Abolition Act. Following this act, Canada did indeed become a place where enslaved people of African descent escaped to gain their freedom. And this is best exemplified and celebrated with stories like the Underground Railroad, which I mentioned earlier, has become almost synonymous with our treatment of enslaved peoples in Canada and have become a point of pride that we often refer to when comparing ourselves to the United States. However, stories like the Underground Railroad have not only kept Canada's past with slavery a secret, but more importantly, it hides another important fact, and one that the scholars that I referred to today have all shown. And that is that Canada and Canadians were not very accommodating to these refugees that escaped the United States. Upon arrival, many faced hostility, racism, and segregation. African refugees that found their freedom in Canada had to go to segregated schools, segregated churches, and even celebrated white settler abolitionists supported these segregationist policies. And while some white settlers were content with segregated schools, churches, and African communities, others formed groups of white settler armed thugs and tried to push these newcomers off their land. Now, Canada was not the tolerant place or the place that enslaved Africans gained their freedom that the myth surrounding the Underground Railroad suggests. In fact, African Canadians were often the scapegoats when things went bad. For instance, closer to my own research, though William Lyon Mackenzie, one of the leaders of the Canadian Rebellion of 1837-38, was on paper an opponent of slavery, he and his patriot supporters were quick to blame the Black loyalists and directed much racism towards African Canadians living in the colony when things went south for the Patriots in 1837-38. Now, this legacy, as Maynard explained, has affected, and I quote, the treatment of Black persons living in Canada for centuries to come. And this is the same quote I used at the beginning of my talk. And really, what this means is quite simply that the legacy of slavery, the violence towards enslaved people, Indigenous and African, and the segregation of racialized communities has created the Canada that we have today. A Canada that, as a nation, benefits white settlers. A Canada whose education system is skewed in favor of white settlers. A Canada in which the immigration of white people was favored. And a Canada in which surveillance and policing is still skewed towards racialized communities. And as more and more people have been pushing Canadians to look back at our country's history and recognize its impact on our present, it is important that we as Canadians acknowledge the lasting impact of the legacy of slavery and racism on Canada and how it is still present today, and fight to change it. Thank you.